Dr. Eliza Washington rushed through the crowded airport terminal, pulling her small carry-on suitcase behind her. At 42 years old, she had mastered the art of efficient travel. Today she wore simple jeans, a comfortable sweater, and minimal makeup, a stark contrast to her usual business attire. After a week of non-stop meetings, she wanted to be comfortable for the 5-hour flight back to Washington, D.C. The boarding area for Flight 372 was packed with travelers. Eliza checked her boarding pass again. Seat 14A, window seat. Perfect. She had important documents to review before Monday's big meeting, and she preferred the privacy of a window seat. When the airline announced pre-boarding for passengers with small children and those needing extra assistance, Eliza noticed dark clouds outside the terminal windows. She frowned. Storms always made her nervous when flying. She approached the gate counter where Captain Richard Thornton stood chatting with the gate agents. The tall, gray-haired pilot had an air of authority in his crisp uniform. "Excuse me, Captain," Eliza said politely. "I notice the weather looks rough. Are we expecting much turbulence today?" Captain Thornton glanced at her briefly, his eyes flickering over her casual clothes and natural hair. He didn't answer, instead turning back to his conversation with the gate agent. Eliza cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, but I was wondering about possible turbulence." The captain's face tightened with annoyance. "We'll make announcements if needed," he said curtly, not meeting her eyes. "Please step aside. We're busy with boarding procedures." Before she could respond, an older white couple approached the counter. "Captain, we're a bit concerned about the weather," the man said warmly. "My wife gets anxious during bumpy flights." Captain Thornton's entire demeanor changed. His face broke into a friendly smile as he turned to give them his full attention. "Nothing to worry about, folks. We're looking at some light chop over the mountains, but I've chosen an altitude that should keep us above the worst of it. I've been flying this route for 15 years. You're in good hands." The couple thanked him, clearly relieved. The captain even offered them some tips about when to expect the smoothest parts of the flight. Eliza stood there, stunned by the different treatment. She wasn't imagining it. Several nearby passengers had noticed too, exchanging uncomfortable glances. "First class and priority members may now begin boarding," announced the gate agent. Eliza took a deep breath and joined the line. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, she could feel the captain's eyes on her. When she looked up, he quickly looked away. On the jet bridge, a flight attendant named Sarah greeted passengers warmly. Eliza smiled back, trying to shake off the unpleasant encounter. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing Eliza's expression. "Just a bit concerned about the weather," Eliza replied. "Don't worry, we'll do our best to make it a smooth ride," Sarah assured her with genuine kindness. As Eliza settled into her seat, she pulled out her phone and made a quick note about the incident, including the captain's name and flight number. After 15 years as a highly respected aviation executive, she had experienced similar situations before, but this time felt different. What Captain Thornton didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed from her casual appearance, was exactly who he had just dismissed as unimportant. And in 3 days, he would find out. For now, Eliza tucked away her phone and opened her book. The real story was just beginning. The flight took off with a powerful rumble, pushing Eliza back into her seat. As the plane climbed higher, the promised turbulence began. The aircraft shook and dipped, causing several passengers to grip their armrests tightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thornton speaking," came the smooth voice over the intercom. "We're experiencing some expected turbulence. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please pause service." Eliza had just opened her laptop when the plane dropped suddenly. Her stomach lurched as several passengers gasped. A child began crying a few rows behind. The "fastened seatbelts" sign flashed brightly overhead. 20 minutes later, the turbulence eased. The captain's voice returned, significantly warmer than before. "Folks, we've climbed to a smoother altitude now. We'll do our best to make up some time. Flight attendants will resume service shortly." As promised, the flight attendants began moving through the cabin with drink carts. Sarah, the friendly attendant from earlier, reached Eliza's row. "Water, please," Eliza said with a smile. Just as Sarah handed her the cup, another wave of turbulence hit. Water splashed onto Eliza's lap and her important documents. "I'm so sorry," Sarah exclaimed, quickly offering napkins. "It's okay," Eliza assured her, but her heart sank as she looked at her now wet papers. She needed her medication, which was in her carry-on bag stored in the overhead compartment. "Excuse me," she said to Sarah. "I need to get my medication from my bag. It'll just take a second." Sarah looked concerned. "The seatbelt sign is still on, but if it's urgent—" "It is," Eliza confirmed. "I'll be quick." As Eliza carefully stood and reached for the overhead bin, a stern voice came from behind her. "Ma'am, the seatbelt sign is illuminated. Return to your seat immediately." Eliza turned to see Captain Thornton standing in the aisle, his face fixed in a disapproving frown. He had left the cockpit during this brief calm period, seemingly to stretch his legs. "I understand, Captain," Eliza explained calmly. "I just need my medication from my bag." "The rules apply to everyone," he said loudly, making several passengers turn to watch. "You people always think exceptions should be made." The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet. Did he just say, "You people"? "I simply need my medication," Eliza repeated, maintaining her composure. The captain stepped closer. "Maybe you don't understand how aviation safety works. When that sign is on, everyone stays seated. No exceptions." Sarah intervened. "Captain, she mentioned it's her medication." "I don't care what it is," he interrupted. "Rules are rules. I'm responsible for everyone's safety on this aircraft." A white businessman across the aisle stood up and reached for his bag. "I just need to grab something real quick, too." Instead of reprimanding him, Captain Thornton simply nodded. "Make it fast, sir." The double standard was impossible to miss. Several passengers exchanged glances, and one woman, a few rows up, started recording discreetly with her phone. Eliza, a woman who had helped write aviation safety guidelines herself, remained remarkably calm. "Captain Thornton, I respect safety protocols. However, discrimination is not part of those protocols." His face flushed. "Excuse me? Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm simply stating facts," she replied. "Now, I'm getting my medication, which I'm legally entitled to access." She turned away from him and retrieved her small pill container. The captain stood fuming for a moment before marching back toward the cockpit. As Eliza sat down, Sarah leaned in. "I'm so sorry about that. I've never seen him act that way." "It's not your fault," Eliza said, taking her medication with the remaining water. "But it is someone's responsibility." She pulled out her phone again and added detailed notes about this second incident, including the names of passengers who had witnessed it. By the time they landed, Eliza Washington had made her decision about what needed to happen next. The plane touched down with a gentle bump at Washington Dulles International Airport. As passengers gathered their belongings, the captain's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington, D.C. Local time is 4:45 p.m. with clear skies and temperature at 68 degrees. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with Atlantic Airways today." Eliza remained seated as others rushed to exit. She watched as Captain Thornton emerged from the cockpit, standing near the exit to bid farewell to passengers, smiling broadly at some while barely acknowledging others. When most passengers had departed, Eliza finally stood and approached the exit. The captain glanced at her briefly, then looked away without a word. "Thank you for the flight, Captain Thornton," she said clearly, making sure he heard her name. He nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact. As Eliza walked through the jet bridge, Sarah, the flight attendant, caught up with her. "Ms. Washington, I wanted to apologize again for what happened. That wasn't right." Eliza smiled. "I appreciate that, Sarah. Would you be willing to share your contact information? I may need to follow up about today's events." Sarah looked nervous but nodded. "Of course. Let me write it down for you." After exchanging information, Eliza headed to baggage claim, where her driver was waiting. "Good afternoon, Dr. Washington," he said, taking her carry-on. "How was your flight?" "Educational, James. Very educational," she replied with a slight smile. During the car ride to her Georgetown townhouse, Eliza made several phone calls, first to her assistant, then to the head of human resources at the Federal Aviation Administration, and finally to her close friend Linda, who worked as legal counsel for the Department of Transportation. "Linda, I need your advice on something," she said, keeping her voice even. I had an interesting experience today. By the time she arrived home, Eliza had set her plan in motion. The next morning, she arrived at FAA headquarters before 7 a.m. Her office on the top floor offered a sweeping view of the Potomac River, but she barely noticed it today. Her mind was focused on the task ahead. Eliza's executive assistant, Mark, knocked on her door at 8:30 a.m. "Dr. Washington, I've gathered all the information you requested," he said, placing a thick folder on her desk. "Atlantic Airways' complete history of passenger complaints, pilot records, and their diversity training programs." "Thank you, Mark." "And the meeting?" "Scheduled for Wednesday at 10 a.m. The airline executives believe it's about the new safety regulations rollout. They're sending their chief operations officer, their head of pilot training, and," Mark paused, "Captain Richard Thornton as their senior pilot representative." Eliza nodded. "Perfect. Did you mention my name specifically?" "No, just that the meeting would be with the new Executive Vice President of Regulatory Compliance. They don't know it's you yet." "Good. Let's keep it that way." She opened the folder and began reviewing its contents. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Over the past 5 years, Atlantic Airways had received 24 complaints about discriminatory treatment from passengers of color. 17 of those complaints involved flight crew, and 6 named Captain Thornton specifically. Every complaint had been dismissed as resolved through internal procedures, with no actual consequences. Eliza sighed. This wasn't just about one pilot's behavior. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. She picked up her phone and dialed one more number, the passenger who had recorded the incident on the plane. The woman answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Chen, this is Dr. Eliza Washington from yesterday's flight. I was wondering if you might still have that video you recorded." By Tuesday evening, all the pieces were in place. In less than 24 hours, Captain Richard Thornton would discover exactly who the unimportant passenger really was and what executive power truly looked like. Wednesday morning arrived with a heavy rain battering the windows of the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters. Inside her spacious office, Dr. Eliza Washington reviewed her notes one final time. The airline executives would arrive in 30 minutes. She picked up the phone and called her assistant. "Mark, please make sure the conference room is ready, and bring in those complaint files we discussed." "Already done, Dr. Washington," Mark replied. "And Mrs. Chen just arrived. She's waiting in the reception area." "Perfect. Please show her to my office." A moment later, Mrs. Chen entered, looking slightly nervous. The middle-aged Asian-American woman had been seated 3 rows behind Eliza on the flight. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Chen," Eliza said warmly, shaking her hand. "I know this required rearranging your schedule." "It was no problem, Dr. Washington. What happened on that flight wasn't right." Mrs. Chen took out her phone and pulled up the video. "I actually recorded more than I initially mentioned. I caught both incidents, at the gate and on the plane." Eliza watched the footage carefully. The video clearly showed Captain Thornton dismissing her question at the gate, then enthusiastically helping the white couple immediately after. The second clip captured his confrontation with her over the medication, followed by his permissive response to the white businessman. "This is exactly what I needed," Eliza said. "Would you be willing to share this with the airline executives today?" Mrs. Chen nodded firmly. "Absolutely. Someone needs to address this." At 9:55 a.m., Mark knocked on Eliza's door. "The Atlantic Airways representatives have arrived. They're in conference room A." "Thank you, Mark. Please bring Mrs. Chen in 5 minutes after I begin." Eliza gathered her materials and headed to the conference room. Taking a deep breath outside the door, she straightened her shoulders and entered with confident steps. 4 people rose from their seats as she walked in. She recognized Jeffrey Simmons, the airline's chief operations officer, and Patricia Alvarez, head of pilot training. A younger man she didn't know stood beside them, likely an assistant. And at the far end stood Captain Richard Thornton, looking polished in his formal uniform. "Good morning," Eliza said calmly. "I'm Dr. Eliza Washington, Executive Vice President of Regulatory Compliance." Captain Thornton's expression changed instantly. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by visible shock. He gripped the back of his chair tightly. "Thank you all for coming today," Eliza continued, not acknowledging his reaction. Before we discuss the new safety regulations, there's another matter I'd like to address. She opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. These are passenger complaints filed against Atlantic Airways over the past 5 years regarding discriminatory treatment. 17 involve flight crew members. 6 specifically named Captain Thornton. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Captain Thornton's face had turned pale. Dr. Washington, Jeffrey Simmons began, I assure you we take all complaints seriously. Do you? Eliza cut in, because your records show that all these complaints were marked resolved without any disciplinary action or follow-up training. Patricia Alvarez leaned forward. We have comprehensive diversity training for all staff. Once every 3 years, according to your records, Eliza replied. And it's an online module with no accountability measures. The door opened, and Mark escorted Mrs. Chen into the room. This is Mrs. Chen, a passenger on Flight 372 this past Sunday, the same flight I was on. Eliza turned to Captain Thornton. The flight where you refused to answer my question about turbulence, but eagerly assisted white passengers with the same concern. Captain Thornton's face flushed. I don't recall. Perhaps this will help your memory, Eliza said as Mrs. Chen placed her phone on the table and played the video. The room fell completely silent as they watched both incidents unfold clearly on screen. When the video ended, Captain Thornton stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. This isn't just about one incident or one pilot, Eliza said quietly. This is about a systemic failure in your airline's culture. And today, we're going to address it. The conference room fell silent after Mrs. Chen's video ended. Jeffrey Simmons, the airline's chief operations officer, cleared his throat nervously. Dr. Washington, I want to personally apologize for this incident. This behavior clearly doesn't reflect Atlantic Airways' values. Eliza kept her expression neutral. Mr. Simmons, when 17 similar complaints are filed and ignored, I would argue this behavior exactly reflects your airline's values. Patricia Alvarez, the head of pilot training, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. We had no idea these incidents were so widespread. That's the problem, Eliza replied. Your complaint system is designed to minimize these issues rather than address them. Captain Thornton finally looked up. His face had lost its usual confidence. May I speak? He asked quietly. Eliza nodded. Please do. I don't recall ignoring you specifically at the gate, he began. Sunday was a busy day with the weather concerns. Captain, Eliza interrupted. The video clearly shows you dismissing my question and then immediately helping another passenger with the exact same concern. What made them different from me? The captain's mouth opened, then closed again. He had no answer. And on the plane, she continued. You allowed a white passenger to access his overhead bag while publicly humiliating me for the same action. I was simply enforcing safety protocols, he insisted, his voice growing defensive. Selectively enforcing protocols based on race isn't safety, it's discrimination, Eliza stated firmly. Mrs. Chen spoke up. I've flown over 50 times in the past 2 years. I'd never seen a pilot leave the cockpit to personally scold a passenger about a seatbelt sign. The young assistant who had remained quiet suddenly pulled out a tablet. Sir, he said to Simmons, I've just checked Captain Thornton's record. There are actually 8 complaints, not 6. 2 were filed under a different category. Simmons' face reddened. Why wasn't I informed about this pattern? Because your system is designed to bury these issues, Eliza answered. Each complaint was handled individually, with no one looking for patterns. Captain Thornton suddenly stood up. For a moment, Eliza thought he might walk out. Instead, his shoulders slumped. You're right, he said, surprising everyone. I'd never thought of myself as racist. But watching that video, he shook his head. I can't deny what I saw. I treated you differently, and it wasn't the first time. The room fell silent again. Thank you for that honesty, Captain, Eliza said, her tone softening slightly. She turned to the executives. I have 2 choices here. I can launch a formal FAA investigation into Atlantic Airways discrimination patterns, which would become public record and likely result in hefty fines. Or, Simmons leaned forward anxiously, or we can work together to implement real change. Eliza opened another folder. I prepared a comprehensive plan that would transform how your airline handles these issues. She handed copies to everyone. This includes mandatory quarterly in-person bias training for all staff, an anonymous reporting system that flags repeated offenders, and a transparent review process overseen by an independent committee. Patricia studied the document. This is extensive and necessary, Eliza added. I'm not interested in punishing Atlantic Airways. I want to make it better. She looked directly at Captain Thornton. The same applies to you, Captain. You have two choices. Fight these allegations and likely lose your job, or become part of the solution. Thornton met her gaze. What would being part of the solution look like? You would publicly acknowledge what happened, undergo specialized training, and then help train other pilots. Your experience could be valuable, if you're willing to be honest about it. The captain nodded slowly. I never saw myself this way, but I can't argue with what's on that video. He took a deep breath. I want to do better. Eliza stood up. Then let's begin. We'd have a lot of work to do. As everyone left the conference room, Mrs. Chen approached Eliza. That was impressive. You're changing things from the inside. Eliza smiled. Sometimes the most powerful position isn't about punishment. It's about creating the chance for real transformation. 2 weeks after the conference room confrontation, Eliza sat in her office reviewing Atlantic Airways' first progress report. The airline had moved quickly to implement her recommendations, starting with a complete overhaul of their complaint system. A knock at her door interrupted her reading. Come in, she called. Mark entered with a small package. This just arrived for you, Dr. Washington. It's from Atlantic Airways. Eliza opened the package to find a formal letter of apology signed by the entire executive team, along with a detailed timeline for implementing all her recommended changes. But what caught her attention was a separate envelope with her name written in neat handwriting. She opened it and found a handwritten letter from Captain Thornton. I would have never expected this, she murmured, scanning the contents. The letter was surprisingly personal. Captain Thornton wrote about growing up in a small, homogeneous town and how he had never examined his own biases. He apologized not just for his behavior on the flight, but for all the passengers he had made feel unwelcome over his career. He asked if they could meet in person. Eliza considered the request carefully. Was this genuine remorse, or just an attempt to save his career? The next day, she agreed to meet the captain at a small coffee shop near FAA headquarters. She arrived early and chose a table near the window. Captain Thornton entered wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple button-down shirt. Without his uniform, he looked less imposing. He spotted her and walked over nervously. Dr. Washington, thank you for meeting me, he said, extending his hand. She shook it firmly. Have a seat, Captain. Richard, please, he said, sitting down. I'm not here as a captain today. The conversation started awkwardly. Richard stared into his coffee cup for several moments before speaking. I've been doing the training you recommended, he began. The instructor had us watch videos of ourselves interacting with different passengers. They recorded us without telling us the purpose. Eliza nodded. And what did you see? I saw myself treating people differently based on how they looked, he admitted, his voice strained. Not just race, age, appearance, everything. I'd never noticed it before. Most people don't, Eliza replied. These biases operate beneath our awareness. Richard looked up at her. I've been flying for 23 years. How many people have I made feel unwelcome or unimportant in all that time? Eliza didn't offer him easy comfort. Probably many. But that's not the question you should be asking. What should I be asking? What are you going to do about it now? Richard straightened in his chair. I've been thinking about that. I want to develop a new training program specifically for pilots. We have so much authority in the cabin, and we're barely trained on how to use it fairly. Eliza raised an eyebrow. That sounds promising. I've already spoken with Patricia Alvarez about it. She thinks it could work. His expression grew more animated. Pilots respect other pilots. If I share my story, show them my own videos, maybe they'll listen. For the first time, Eliza smiled. That's exactly the kind of initiative I was hoping to see. Their conversation continued for over an hour. Richard asked thoughtful questions about how to recognize his own biases. Eliza shared some of her experiences as a black woman in aviation leadership. As they prepared to leave, Richard asked one final question. Why did you give me a second chance? You could have ended my career with that video. Eliza considered her answer carefully, because ending careers doesn't change systems. But people willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to fix them, they can change everything. Richard nodded slowly. I won't waste this opportunity. I know you won't, Eliza replied, because I'll be watching. As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, neither noticed the small group of Atlantic Airways flight attendants who had witnessed their meeting from across the street. By evening, word had spread throughout the company. The captain and the executive were working together. Change was really coming. 1 month after their coffee shop meeting, Eliza stood at the back of a large training room at Atlantic Airways headquarters. The room was filled with pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew, about 60 employees in total. At the front, Richard Thornton adjusted the microphone on his lapel. Is this working? He asked, his voice echoing through the speakers. Can everyone hear me? The room quieted as people took their seats. Many pilots still wore puzzled expressions. They had been told only that this was a new mandatory training session about passenger interactions. Good morning, everyone, Richard began. His voice sounded different than it had on the plane. Humbler, less authoritative. I've been a pilot with Atlantic Airways for 15 years. Many of you know me. What you don't know is that 1 month ago, I almost lost my job because of my own biases. A murmur rippled through the audience. Pilots rarely admitted mistakes, especially not publicly. Richard pointed to a screen behind him. I'm going to show you something uncomfortable. This is me, on a flight last month. The video began playing, the same footage Mrs. Chen had recorded. As the room watched Richard dismiss Eliza at the gate and then confront her on the plane, faces grew serious. When the video ended, the room was completely silent. That's hard to watch, Richard admitted. But what's harder is knowing this wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern I never recognized in myself. He explained how the incident had led to a review of passenger complaints and the discovery of similar incidents throughout his career. I'm not here to make excuses, he continued. I'm here because I want us all to learn from my mistakes. From the back of the room, Eliza watched various reactions play out across people's faces. Some pilots looked defensive, others uncomfortable. A few nodded in recognition. Richard invited Sarah, the flight attendant from the incident, to join him at the front. Sarah tried to intervene that day, he explained. But I shut her down. That was another mistake. Our crew should feel empowered to speak up when they see problems. Sarah spoke briefly about her experience that day and how helpless she had felt. I knew what was happening wasn't right, she said, but I didn't know how to stop it without risking my job. As the training continued, Richard introduced a series of scenarios. In each one, participants had to identify subtle biases and discuss better approaches. The room gradually became more engaged, with even initially skeptical pilots joining the conversation. 2 hours later, as the session ended, Richard made one final announcement. This isn't a one-time training. It's the beginning of a new approach at Atlantic Airways. And to make sure we stay on track, I'd like to introduce someone who has been instrumental in developing this program. He gestured toward the back of the room. Dr. Eliza Washington, Executive Vice President of Regulatory Compliance at the FAA. Eliza walked to the front as people turned in surprise. Some recognized her immediately from the video. Thank you, Richard, she said, taking the microphone. What you witnessed today is remarkable, not just a training session, but a demonstration of real accountability and growth. She explained how Atlantic Airways was now implementing a comprehensive program that would serve as a model for other airlines. Change doesn't happen through punishment alone, she told them. It happens when people are brave enough to recognize their mistakes and do the hard work to fix them. As the session broke up, several pilots approached Richard to speak privately. Others came to Eliza to share their own experiences with bias in the industry. Later, as they walked out together, Richard turned to Eliza. Was this what you hoped for? She watched the groups of employees still deep in conversation, no longer defensive, but genuinely engaged. It's a good start, she said. Real change takes time. But this, people talking honestly about difficult issues, this is how it begins. 6 months after the incident on Flight 372, A crowd gathered in the main conference hall of the National Aviation Conference in Chicago. Industry leaders from across the country filled the seats, curious about the panel discussion titled Transforming Airline Culture: The Atlantic Airways Story. Dr. Eliza Washington sat at the center of the panel table, flanked by Jeffrey Simmons, Atlantic Airways Chief Operations Officer, Patricia Alvarez, Head of Pilot Training, and Captain Richard Thornton. The audience buzzed with conversation. Word had spread about Atlantic Airways' remarkable transformation. "Good morning, everyone," Eliza began, tapping her microphone. "Thank you for joining us today. 6 months ago, an incident occurred that could have ended as just another complaint filed and forgotten. Instead, it became the catalyst for real change." She nodded to Richard, who took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "Most of you know me as Captain Thornton," he began. "What you don't know is that 6 months ago, I was the subject of a discrimination complaint that could have ended my career." Richard recounted the story honestly, sparing himself no criticism. He described his dismissive treatment of Eliza at the gate, his confrontation with her on the plane, and his initial defensiveness when faced with the evidence. "I had two choices," he continued. "I could deny everything and probably lose my job, or I could acknowledge my mistakes and work to fix not just my behavior, but the system that allowed it." Jeffrey Simmons spoke next, explaining how the airline had completely redesigned their complaint system. "In the past 6 months, we've addressed 43 previously overlooked complaints. Every single one received personal follow-up and appropriate action." Patricia Alvarez described the new training program, which had now been completed by every employee. "Our incident reports show a 78% decrease in passenger complaints related to discriminatory treatment," she reported proudly. When it was Eliza's turn again, she smiled at the audience. The easy path would have been punishment. File charges, fire the pilot, issue a press release claiming the problem was solved. That wouldn't have changed anything. She gestured to the panel around her. "Real change happens when people commit to difficult conversations and ongoing work." Atlantic Airways didn't just change their policies, they changed their culture. After the formal presentation, the panel opened the floor for questions. A young flight attendant from another airline stood up. "This all sounds great, but most companies don't change unless they're forced to. What really made the difference here?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Having to face the person I had wronged," he said, looking at Eliza. "Not in a courtroom or a disciplinary hearing, but in a conversation where I couldn't hide from what I had done." As the session ended, several airline executives approached the panel, asking for details about implementing similar programs at their companies. Industry publications gathered around for interviews. Later that evening, at a small dinner for the panelists, Eliza raised her glass in a toast. "To facing uncomfortable truths," she said, "and to the hard work of real change." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've been thinking about that day on the plane a lot. If you had immediately revealed who you were, used your position to threaten me, I would have just been defensive." "That's why I didn't," Eliza replied. "Power used only to punish rarely creates lasting change." Jeffrey Simmons shook his head in amazement. 6 months ago, I was terrified this incident would destroy our airline's reputation. Instead, we're now being recognized as industry leaders in inclusive practices." As they finished their meal, Patricia nudged Richard. "Tell her about the Pilot Association." Richard smiled proudly. "We've started a mentoring program for pilots from underrepresented groups. 20 senior pilots are now mentoring 40 new recruits." Eliza looked around the table at these people who had once been adversaries and were now partners in change. The incident that began with dismissal and disrespect had transformed not just one pilot or one airline, but was now spreading throughout the industry. This is how real change happens, she thought. Not through shame or force, but through accountability, honesty, and the chance for redemption.